In this episode of Lawyers with Game, we have a conversation with video game industry icon Garry Kitchen, the king of Donkey Kong. Stay tuned, you won't want to miss it.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Lawyers with Game. I'm your host, Darius Gambino. I'm an attorney with Saul Ewing in Philadelphia. Over 20 years of practice, I've advised clients on issues related to patents, trademarks, and copyrights. I'm also a lifelong gamer, currently playing on the PlayStation 5, and my PlayStation Network ID is EaglesFan71. With me today is my colleague in gaming, Angie Cespedes. We are both members of the Esports and Video Gaming practice at Saul Ewing. Angie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Angie Cespedes, and I'm a partner at Saul Ewing, based out of our Miami office. And I am a litigator by trade and also one of the leaders of our sports and entertainment practice group nationally. I represent sports teams, their facilities, leagues. I also represent businesses in business disputes, both in a litigation context and a dispute resolution context. And we are really excited about today's episode. Thanks, Darius.
Thanks, Angie. We are really excited to have with us today Garry Kitchen, legendary video game designer. He's designed games for the Commodore 64, the Atari 2600, the Nintendo Entertainment System, Super NES, you name it. He's been doing it for a long time. Garry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's an honor to talk to you. I've probably played every game that for a system that you've made, including the ones that you made before there were any home systems. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But first, I wanted to talk about this right here. I have the original in-box Donkey Kong for the Atari 2600. Now, if I can explain to people today how excited I was to be able to play Donkey Kong at home, it was, and for me and everyone else in the 80s generation, we were in arcades, we were in pizza parlors playing Shigeru Miyamoto's game, Donkey Kong, and we were so desperate to be able to play it at home so we didn't have to spend our quarters on it. And you were the one that did the port of that game to the 2600. Can you talk about, and that was in 1982, I think. Can you talk a little bit about what you were doing at that time and how you got involved with that project?
That was an incredibly iconic project and an enormous amount of work. I had recently, before that project came along, been working for a small consulting firm in New Jersey named Wickstead Design Associates. And at Wickstead, we had done some very exciting things in electronic toys, microprocessor-based products, handheld toys for people like Parker Brothers. And I saw a transition in the industry because the Atari had just come out, the original, call it the 2600 or the VCS. And I went to management and said, look, we should be figuring out how to do games on this. And their initial response was disinterest, but within a month or two, I convinced them. And the challenge at that point was it wasn't an open system. Today, you can program for your Mac or your PC or your iPhone or Android, and everything's available. Back then, everything was a trade secret. So you couldn't program the Atari because there was no manual, there was no documentation. And it was a really bizarre piece of silicon that made that game system work because it was really pushed from the standpoint of cost. Microprocessors, memory were all incredibly expensive. So to get it to a price point where consumers could buy a video game machine, it was really challenging. So anyway, moving on to Donkey Kong, at the firm I was working at, I eventually convinced them that I would go out and buy an Atari 2600 at retail, bring it back, open it up, and reverse engineer it and figure out how it worked just through my engineering knowledge. And I did that. Basically, I wired up a harness that went between the Atari machine and my Apple II computer, which was brand new, and I had just bought. Fortuitously, the Apple and the Atari both ran under the same microprocessor family, the 6502, which many of the early systems ran on. So using the Apple II in combination with tearing apart the Atari, I was able in 6 months' time to figure out how it worked. I wrote a game. My company I was working for brought that game to market, and I left the company and went out on my own. And shortly thereafter, Coleco, the Connecticut Leather Company, as it was known at the time, who also did Cabbage Patch dolls and all sorts of other things, had also decided they wanted to get into the game industry. So they went to Nintendo, who at that point was not in the U.S. Home market at all. The Donkey Kong machine that we all loved was a $3,000 beast that sat in the arcade, used a 16-bit microprocessor, had a ton of RAM in it, and was incredibly powerful. Well, they went to them and said, we'd like to buy the home rights. So they paid Nintendo a lot of money to get the rights to do a version of Donkey Kong, which at that point was the biggest selling arcade game, number one game in the country. And then they got on the phone to find somebody to do it. And the problem was the only people in the country, in the world, that were doing it were all the people that worked at Atari, all the people that worked at Activision, which was a spinoff from Atari, and me. I think at that point I was the only independent person who was available who knew how to program the Atari because I had reverse engineered it. So they eventually found me, and I said, oh, yeah, sure, great, let's do it, knowing what complete hell it would be to try to put it on that underpowered little platform. That's how I got to it. And that was probably in May of 1982. And they needed it done in 3 months,
Wow.
which was absolutely insanity.
Wow. So, just Garry, before we hop into the next, kind of line of questions here, I think it's important to kind of tell the story as to how Darius and I figured out that you were part of our Saul Ewing family, so to speak. About a year ago, our firm has these annual retreats, and it was the first one we were having where they got all our almost, 500 lawyers together since COVID. And they mixed us all up so we could all, talk to each other and get to know each other. I was, new to the firm. I had joined Saul Ewing right at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. So it was kind of, for me at least, one of the first times I was sitting in a room with literally everybody, as opposed to just these Zoom calls. And one of the lawyers who I had never actually seen in person, even though we had seen each other over Zoom, is one of my partners, one of Darius' partners, named Stephen Ravin. And he, is sitting there talking to me, and he's like, oh yeah, you're into all that video gaming stuff with Darius Gambino. You guys have that show. And I, kind of don't understand half the stuff you guys talk about, but one of my really good friends and one of our clients loves all that video gaming stuff. I should put you in contact with him. And, lo and behold, he emails you and copies you and kind of introduces you. And Darius and I have many moments, I think, especially since the start of having filmed Lawyers with Game. We're now, in the middle of season 3, where we fangirl and fanboy out. And when we realized it was you, Garry, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So anyway, thank you so much for being with us here today. And you are honestly one of the rock stars. When Darius showed the Donkey Kong game, it gives me goosebumps. I remember I was about 8-9 years old at the time, and it just brings back such amazing memories. Yeah, so speaking of which, so I know you touched upon this a little bit, but after the success of game consoles like Atari, which, by the way, I have the Lego version behind me that I built with my 10-year-old son, Intellivision and ColecoVision, which we touched upon, we saw more computing companies get into gaming with platforms like the Commodore 64 and the Apple II series. Your next big project after Donkey Kong was developing a piece of software called Garry Kitchen's GameMaker, which, at the time was just, kind of mind-blowing and so new and innovative, that allowed users to make their own games. Can you talk about that project a bit and tell us how that came to be and how that rolled out?
Sure. Just to set the record straight, I did do a couple of big games between. So after Donkey Kong, I ended up joining Activision, which was one of those two companies that were publishing in the industry. Activision was a young upstart. They were printing money. They had spun out of Atari and were just known within gamers and the industry as doing by far the best quality Atari games. I mean, my initial reaction was when I heard of Activision, I said, what idiots would dare to do games on an Atari machine? You know, they'll never be able to do it. And then I saw their first two games and I was blown away. So I called them, introduced myself, said I was doing games. They learned I was doing Donkey Kong for Coleco. That gave me a little bit of credibility. Didn't believe I was doing Atari games till I told them that. And then I ended up joining their office. I set up an office in New Jersey. They were based in California. Did a couple of big games for them. Keystone Capers was nominated for Video Game of the Year. That was my follow-up to Donkey Kong. But anyway, long story short, you can have an entire segment about the crash of the game industry. But in 83, 84, a whole lot of other people also decided to reverse engineer the Atari. And before you knew it, there were 20 or 30 companies making games for the Atari. And there weren't that many talented game designers to fill that pipeline. So Christmas of 1984, the stores were full of $2 games that were terrible that no one would buy. So Christmas of 84, Toys R Us and Walmart threw up their hands and said, we're done with the industry. Video games are dead. We're not carrying it anymore. That was a shock to consumers no one had sent them out a memo telling them the video games were gone, but the retailers had had enough because they lost their shirts on a lot of markdowns of inventory. So anyway, that's how I ended up on the Commodore 64. We had a meeting at Activision because our Atari games weren't selling anymore, and management decided we've got to switch to home computers. And by the way, don't do anything that's like a video game. Do something different. Do something creative. People on home computers expect, something really innovative. So if you're thinking of doing just a, run and jump or platform game, don't do it. So there we were. And I had this crazy idea to make a programming toy. I mean, I found programming to be really fun. We were writing in assembly language, really hard, but I really enjoyed that. It was like a puzzle to me. So I brainstormed with some of my coworkers how I would make a toy out of programming. And the first thing I did is I made a title called The Designer's Pencil. And what that was a number 2 pencil on the screen, beautiful, on an angle, very 3D looking, sitting on a white piece of paper. That's all the screen was. And then you popped up a little window that allowed you to write code. And it was very simple English language code that said, move the pencil left, move it up, move it down, move it right, make a circle with it, make a square with it. And you could use variables and loops. And by doing that, you could make the pencil draw on the paper. And it was really kind of fun and addictive. And it was ahead of its time. I thought it was brand new. I found out later there was a programming language called Logo out of MIT, which did something simpler. I wasn't aware of it at the time. But that was a mild success, a critical success, but a mild success because a lot of the audience may not have understood it. But the number one request I got from all the people who did buy it was, well, I want to program it. I want to make a game. I mean, it'd be really cool to do images and pictures, but why can't I make a game? So thus, I used that code base and spent a year creating GameMaker. And what GameMaker was, most people don't know this, but in modern video game programming, you use something called an IDE, which is an integrated development environment. You don't just start with any old hardware and software. You get the IDE for the PlayStation. You get the IDE for the Xbox. And that is an environment that gives you tools specific to the platform, plus programming capability, debugging, all of those things. GameMaker was the first game IDE. So I created an IDE for the Commodore 64. It had the ability to create animations, the ability to draw, the ability to write code, debug code, and create music and sound effects, all in a whole tool set. And then when you had your game and you liked it, you took a blank disk, you put it in the Commodore, pushed a button, and what you got out was a commercially viable game that you could sell on a disc. And it was critically acclaimed. It was, in hindsight, 5 or 10 years ahead of its time. I meet a lot of people in the game industry who say, "Oh, you did that. That's why I'm in the game industry. I started with that. It got me into it. It taught me what I wanted to do for a living." I mean, I can't tell you how wonderful that is to hear that. But it didn't sell an enormous amount of units. But I wish I had done it a little later, because it's the type of project that I still would be working on today. Because back then, you finished Donkey Kong, it got shipped, and you moved on to your next game. That was the way the industry was. Today, you ship something, it lives forever. You upgrade it for the next platform. I wish that had been the environment GameMaker was in, because there would have ended up being a GameMaker for the PlayStation. But as it is, I was very proud of it. I thought it was very hard to do, but well worth the effort. And it was my little, foray into tools for the game industry.
Listen, and whether people admit it or not, I'm sure it was just absolutely inspirational. I mean, absolutely inspirational. But you're right. I mean, timing is everything. And the world wasn't, I think, maybe ready for it just yet.
I mean, it won a lot of awards. It won a Software Publishers Association award, which at the time was huge. And it won Video Game of the Year and Computer Game of the Year from a few magazines. So the people that understood what it was were just gleeful about it. But it needed a little more time. Right after it, products like Director came out from Macromedia, and Director was a multimedia development tool. And then Flash came, and then all these other, and all of those laid the groundwork for all the multimedia work that's done today. GameMaker predated all those and was very much like them, but was shipped with the mentality of one release, one product, move on. So,
yeah, definitely a really cool and revolutionary idea and product. I wanted to take you back to the time period before console games, before games were delivered on cartridges in the 80s. Anyone that grew up in that time period remembers the Mattel football game, where you made a series of LED dots move around, and we played it for hours and hours, even though it was a very simple game. One of the other ones that I played for hours and hours was a game called Wildfire from Parker Brothers, which was a handheld pinball machine that actually had bumpers on both sides and gave you the experience of actually playing pinball in your hand. And I love that game. You programmed that game. Tell us a little bit about that time period and how that game came to be.
Yeah, that's actually an incredible story. Wildfire was the first commercial software product I ever did. I did not know how to program when Wildfire started. I worked for these two guys who were older than me. One was an engineer, one was an industrial designer. They were very polished and, knew how to get big clients. I mean, and they were absolutely brilliant. And I learned so much from them. Well, it was a little company. It was 4 of us over a liquor store in a little tiny facility in Glen Rock, New Jersey, around the corner from the Nabisco factory where they baked Oreos, and you could smell them if you put the window open of our office.
Perfect recipe for a
It
startup.
was.
Oreos, liquor. I don't know that
It
you get
was.
better
It was
than that.
fabulous. Those were the days. So I started working there while I was in college, and I was just the guy who got the sandwiches and made sure there were M&Ms and Coke in the fridge. That was my job. I knew nothing about anything. So I learned engineering while working there because there were so few of us that if a deadline happened, it was all hands on deck. And they'd say, have you ever tried? You ever done this? Do you know what this is? And I'd say, no, but show me. So anyway, they would overpromise to get a big client. I mean, just tell them they'll do anything. So they met with Parker Brothers. We had been doing work with calculator chips and with like photographic timers. The old digital clocks, we did a lot of the very early digital clocks. So you're lighting up LEDs and you're using a microprocessor, 4-bit microprocessor. And then we see the Mattel football and we bring it in. We all look at it and we go, well, they're lighting up LEDs with a 4-bit microprocessor, but they're doing something that's fun. Let's do that. I mean, calculators are great, but a little boring. So we started playing with that, came up with a couple of ideas. They went to Parker Brothers and showed it to them. And Parker Brothers said, well, I like your ideas, but we have an idea already. So what they had was they had a working version of this pinball machine. We didn't invent it. It was invented by a former NASA engineer. Bob Doyle was his name. Brilliant guy. And his wife, Holly, I guess it was. And the two of them had come up with this idea and invented it. And he was a rocket scientist. He knew how to build something like that, but he knew how to do it with $20,000 in electronics. So he had this briefcase that had a 16-bit microprocessor, RAM, all this stuff in it with an umbilical cord that went to the game. So Parker Brothers showed that to us and said, it's incredible. And we agreed it was really fun. But we need to do it for a $7 manufacturing cost, or else we can't sell it. I mean, everybody's not getting a briefcase. So our guys said, oh, yeah, we can do that. No problem. And then they walked out, came back, told me and the other engineers. So we told them we could do this. And we were like, are you insane? So anyway, they weren't that far off the mark. Yes, we could do it. The timing was horrible. You'll notice a theme. Every project I ever did had a horrible schedule. That's the way it is in consumer electronics. So we used a 4-bit microprocessor, which required programming. Has 1,500 bytes of memory in it. And you've got to write a 4-bit program. And we hired a consultant to do it. And we said, don't worry about it. We got the programming going. This guy has all these years of experience programming mainframes. He's going to be great. And we got about 6 or 8 weeks into the project, about 4 weeks away from Parker Brothers, expecting to get a prototype from us of our version of the game. And the way our guy would work, our consultant, is he would write it all in longhand. And at the end of his workday, of his day job, would drop off all these sheets of paper. And I was low man in the totem pole, so they went to me, and I typed them all in because he had done them all in longhand. So every night I would sit there for hours typing in, no idea what it was, no idea. I couldn't program. I was just typing all this stuff in. Eventually, a time comes, he says, we're ready to play the game. And I've typed in many, many pages. Well, first of all, I learned later that's not how you program. I program a small task. I want to light up a light bulb. And then I test it. And then I say I want to make a flipper do something. And then I test it. And you build in modules. And you're constantly testing. You do not type in 5,000 lines of code and expect it to work. It's not how it works. So anyway, he tried it. It didn't work. Everybody held their breath. We tried it again. It didn't work. He said, I know what it is. We made a change. Tried it again. Didn't work. He said, oh, I got it. made another change, tried it again, it didn't work. This went on for a few hours. And he said, "Are you sure this hardware works?" And we said, "Oh, yeah, we're sure the hardware works." And then he went home. And we never saw him again. So at that point in time, it was a panic meeting. 4 of us stood in the conference room. Well, 4 of us and the 2 managers. And they said, "Anybody know how to program?" Everybody said, "No." But all the guys around me stepped back and leave me standing there. And I said, "Well, I'll try." I said, "I read what he did, so I guess I have a leg up. I don't know what it was, but I read it." So we had 3 weeks to show something to Parker Brothers. So I worked 100 hours a week, and after 3 weeks, I had a ball rolling around.
Wow.
And it wasn't finished
Amazing.
in 3 weeks, but about 2 months later, I finished it. So that's the first code I ever wrote, and I did it under duress with a crazy schedule, but I really loved doing it. I mean, once I learned how to program, I was like, "Oh, this makes perfect sense to me. This is for me. It's a puzzle, and it's logical," and I had a great time. But that was the craziness of it.
That's absolutely amazing. I love stories like that.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Had it happened any other way, what happens next, of course, would never have happened. Which, speaking of which, so moving on to 1986, you founded your own game publishing company called Absolute Entertainment.
Right.
And you produced many games over the following, decade. Can you talk to us about that company, some of the games you worked on there, and how you transitioned to making games for the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super NES during that time? We're talking, Battle Tank, The Simpsons, Bart versus the Space Mutants, Home Alone, etc.
Yep.
And that universe of what was going on during that time period for you.
Sure. Well, when I joined Activision, and our primary platform was the 2600, the Atari. I did some early games on that platform that were very well received, and Activision, unlike every other video game company almost in history, actually gave authorship credit to the game. I mean, John Grisham writes great thrillers. Why shouldn't I know that John Grisham wrote the thriller? So it was Garry Kitchen's Keystone Capers, or Garry Kitchen's Pressure Cooker, or my good friend David Crane did Pitfall. And we all got credit for our games. So when I came out of Activision in 85, they hadn't been able to live through the crash. So by 85, they were in tough shape. They ended up going through a prepackaged bankruptcy, were bought for next to nothing, came out of it, and now today are the largest game software company in the world. But it's not the same Activision. It has name only, but it went through a bankruptcy. But anyway, so David Crane, who founded Activision, left and with me and some of my people who were working in the East Coast. And we all decided we'd start a game company. We started Absolute. Well, it was very clear to us that video games hadn't gone away, even though Activision had decided that they had, because Nintendo was trying to enter the market. And Nintendo went to Toys R Us and Walmart and people like that and showed them their game system, which was a massive hit in Japan. In Japan, it was called the Famicom, Family Computer System. And they got chased out of the building by Walmart and Toys R Us. Said, "Don't ever show me a video game system again." So what they did is they repackaged it. They put a robot in it. They called it the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was not a video game. They weren't cartridges. They were packs, P-A-K-S. So you got packs and you played with a robot. And by the way, it displayed on a screen and you played games, but that was not the main part of it. And they told Toys R Us that they would test market it in New York area. Another piece of luck, I happened to be in the New York area at that point. So they were test marketing in the New York area Christmas of 85, and they would guarantee every sale. It was on commission. Basically, every sale or else we take the units back, 100%. And Toys R Us agreed, and it sold like crazy. And magically, the video game industry was back again. So when we left, Activision, first thing we did was say, what's the state of the video game industry? Well, hey, look at that. Nintendo's reestablishing it. So we went to Nintendo. I went to Nintendo in Seattle, got a meeting, went up there early 86 maybe, and said, look, we're game designers. We have David Crane, founder of Activision, Pitfall, the largest original game ever done on the Atari, outside of Pac-Man and Donkey Kong, the original title. And we want to do games on the platform. And they said, well, why would you want to do that? And I was like, okay. Well, because you're going to sell the platform and we're going to sell great games. And they said there are over 1,000 games in Japan for Famicom. We don't need them. You want to publish games? Go to Japan, license all the games you want, bring them to the U.S. market and sell them. And we said, yeah, but there's cultural differences. There are games in Japan that will not sell in the U.S. because the culture is so different. No, we're not interested. So I did this every 3 or 6 months for probably a year. Probably went up there 4 times. Hi, Mr. Kitchen. How are you? Good to see you. We go into conference and we sit, we talk. Nope. So then finally they said to us, all right, this is the 4th time up. Here you go. So we signed on as the first North American developer of games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Outside of us, no one had ever developed games except for the Far East. Japan was really it. And the reason was, they said, look, we're going to allow you to do this, but there's no development equipment in English. Our development system is $35,000 and the documentation's in Japan, and that's it. So fine, if you'll do that, that's all we got. So we said, well, can we make our own? Do you mind if we make our own development system? And they said, we don't care. So we signed up. We developed our own development hardware and IDE, like we talked about before, for the Nintendo system. And we started doing games on it. And that was a very good decision.
Yeah, you think? Yeah.
Now, the other people in North America who wanted to do this went to Nintendo and said, we want to do it. And they told them the story about the $35,000 Japanese development system. And they said, well, aren't there any other choices? And they said, well, you know, Garry Kitchen, call him. I think they have a development system. So not only did we start making games for it, we started selling development systems to other Western developers in the UK and Canada and the US that wanted to make games on the system, because now we had the only system that was English language documented to do the games.
I feel like dragging my kids in here, Garry, and making you repeat that so they can understand, the lessons of innovation and persistence. It
was very much, it was persistence and brilliance, and not brilliance on my part, because I would have never promised, yes, we'll make our own development system. I mean, that is not an easy thing to do. But I had David Crane, and there's no hardware, software engineer on this planet who's as smart as David Crane. And when Activision had started, first thing he did, he spent 2 weeks, made development systems for the Intellivision, the Atari, the Commodore 64, and I knew he could do it. So I said,
you pick your friends wisely. That's the third lesson.
Exactly
there
right.
You go. Yeah.
So that got us into Nintendo, and we ended up doing NES, Super NES. We did Sega games, Genesis, and it was a great run. I mean, for about 10 years, we published on all the 8 and 16-bit platforms, and it was great fun.
It's amazing. Every story is, another amazing tale of, the world behind all the video games that we've loved growing up. So, and that kind of leads me into what I wanted to ask you about. Your current company, Audacity Games, is developing games that I would consider to be more retro. They're intended for the Atari 2600. There's been a real renaissance, I would say, in the last 5 years or so with people mostly from my generation that grew up in the 80s, wanting to play those old games. You see like in the stores preloaded 2600s and preloaded Genesis machines that have games on them, and vintage video games are selling on eBay for sometimes thousands of dollars. I saw a vintage version of the ColecoVision version of Donkey Kong in the shrink wrap in the box, graded because they grade video games now, selling for about $35,000, which was the same price as the development kit from Nintendo. So, what are you seeing in terms of that that kind of need in the industry for vintage games, and tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Audacity.
Audacity, honestly, is for fun. And it's really a hobby for David Crane and I. We're not going to make any money on it. And we're not making any money on it. But we did it because when the retro game craze started to really happen about 10 or 12, maybe 15 years ago, people started really getting excited about the old platforms. First the 2600, now it moved a little bit more focused on the NES, Super NES. And we started getting invitations to go to shows and speak. So we'll go to a show, there'll be a panel exactly like this, and people from the audience will ask us questions exactly like this, and we will answer them, and they love it, and then they'll ask for our autograph or take a picture with us or whatever. So we did that for a number of years. We would go to these shows. As long as they paid our airfare, we didn't care. We didn't charge money. People said, how much do you charge for an autograph? And I said, what, are you kidding me? And we would never charge for autographs. So anyway, more and more as these shows got bigger and bigger. I mean, there's one in Portland actually coming up in a couple of weeks, Portland Retro Gaming. And that show draws thousands of people. I mean, it is full. Well, people would come to us and say, hey, have you seen that people are programming the Atari? And it was homebrew is what they call it. And it wasn't companies. It was a guy who's a programmer who decides to try to write a game on the Atari 2600. And, all these hobbyists have cobbled together tools, not sophisticated tools, but tools. And there were a few dribbling out over the years. There'd be one or two that come out homebrew. And they said, hey, people are doing homebrew. Why don't you and Dave do a game? And we were like, oh, God. It's no easier to do them now than it was back then. Back then, it was incredibly hard to write a decent Atari game. And the reason was how underpowered the Atari is. I was actually speaking to a neighbor recently who's an engineer, and he is very brilliant guy. He used to program, IBM 360s and all these other systems. And he said, somebody said in the room how much memory was in the Atari. And he jumped in and said, oh, I doubt there was much. How much was there, Garry? Like 4K? And I said, are you talking about RAM? Like the original Apple had 16K of RAM. Original PC had 16K of RAM. Bill Gates said, you'll never need more than 640K of RAM. So K, that's 1,000. 16,000 bytes of RAM. I said, Mike, the Atari 2600 had 128 bytes of RAM. Not 128K, 128 individual bytes of RAM. I had to pick them up off the floor.
Yeah, but you still had amazing games. People were able to, design amazing games even with that limitation.
You worked around what you had. And the cartridges were 4K or 8K or 2K. I wanted to go to 8K on Donkey Kong. They wouldn't let me. It cost too much. So it was a 4K cartridge, 4,096 bytes, the entire program. So anyway, it's really hard to do something on there with that limitation. Now, there are people who have actually started making boards that go into an Atari 2600 that add an ARM chip, a second processor. And they wire it into the Atari bus. So you can actually write in a higher level language. The ARM runs it at 20 times the speed of the Atari. It gives you more RAM, and you can do amazing things. So everybody said, well, just do that. But me and Dave eventually, after one too many of the shows, said, we're working really hard on expert witness stuff. That's really our primary. We're in great demand in that category of work. So one day we said, in between projects, why don't we try to do something? And we both agreed that it would be unfair for us to use an ARM chip or anything with extra RAM. The only thing we would do, and we were really forced to do it, was you can't buy 4K memory chips anymore, or 8K or 16. I mean, you can't. So we made a board with the smallest ROM that we could get, and it was 32 banks of 4K. So it's 128K of in the game. And we said, well, we have to do that because it's the only chip that's made that would be compatible with that system. So that's our only advantage, is we have more ROM to make the game. We still do it with 128 bytes. We still do it with a 1 megahertz microprocessor. We don't use ARM chips. So we said, if we're going to do it, we're going to do it plain vanilla old hardware. And we decided to make a game. And we said, we'll work on it when we're not doing anything else. Well, it took 3 years, nights and weekends. We would talk on the phone. Dave would say, do we have any time to work on the game? We really need to make some. And so we would do it. And we code-designed it. I did all the art. And art on the 2600 is not drawing. It's code. You don't draw in 2600. You can't display drawings. It's code. So I did art. Dave did all the game code. We did a game called Circus Convoy. And it is really a wonderful 2600 game. Most people have said it's the best 2600 game I've ever done, because we were the best programmers on 2600 in the day, and we put 3 years of work into it, so it better be good. And it also uses a really big ROM. And we sold it. Most important thing we recognized is people they think they want to be able to just download a file and run it. But that's not recreating the old days. The old days is a beautiful box, 4-color printed box, a beautiful manual, 4-color manual, a cartridge with a beautiful label on it. Well, the cartridges aren't made anymore because Atari's out of business. Nobody has a plastic mold to make an injection molded cartridge. So when people sell these things, they buy old cartridges, tear the label off, and use used cartridges. We weren't going to do any of that. We made a mold. We made an injection mold for an Atari 2600 cart. We did 4-color label, 4-color box, 4-color manual, all as if you bought it in 1982 at Toys R Us. We sold it for $60. And for $99, you could get a collector's edition, which was autographed by Dave and I. And you got a binary version that you could use in machines. So you could download it and use it in certain machines that just had RAM, that didn't accept cartridges. And then we did a collector's edition, I guess we called it. It was $129. And it came with one-of-a-kind items. Like Circus Convoy was about a convoy of trucks. So it had a truck that had the Circus Convoy logo on it. There were only 100 of those made. And we sold everything. And we broke even. And that was fine, because that's all we cared about, was that we had done something for the audience. We did it for them. We didn't do it for us. They begged us for a game. We did a game. And now we have other games in development. But we'll end up breaking even on those as well.
I know Angie has one more question for you before we go, but I wanted to, you reminded me that the art on those Atari games, the art on the outside of those games, the games themselves maybe weren't that exciting, But that art, when you go back and look at that, the art for Missile Command and
The cover
the
art,
art for
yes.
Adventure, the artists that did those just, brought everything to life and made it exciting to buy that in the store. So,
yes, I mean, I agree with you, yes, but it's a double-edged sword. We used to make fun of those covers because if you bought, you remember Breakout?
yeah,
Ball hitting bricks, knocking them out? Well, if you read the back of that box, it said, "You're flying in space." Well, how are we flying in space?
right.
So it depicted flying in space, but you bought it and it was one dot knocking out other dots. So we tried to make our cover of Circus Convoy artistically beautiful, but it looks like what's going on in the game.
Yeah,
Right.
so the good old days, Garry, when you actually had to use your imagination for God's
Yes,
sakes.
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. But
So
yes,
it's-
Audacity is great fun, but it's going to continue to put games out. We actually have games in development, but it's really a labor of love.
So it's funny, Garry. Your stories remind me. I have a bunch of friends who have a similar debate over golf. Are you walking the course or are you using the golf cart?
Yes.
And it sounds to me like you're a walker of the course. Although in Florida, I'd rethink that in the summer. But it sounds to me like you guys are walking the course. You're purists, which I love.
We have to be purists.
So you mentioned it a little bit in passing that you guys have since about 2012 time period started working as expert witnesses and you testify in court based on your years of experience in the video game industry. And I've got to tell you, it's really, a specialized area and it's coming up, more and more in the litigation that I'm involved with. And I know some of my partners are involved with on a variety of different spectrums, IP considerations, contractual issues, licensing issues, you name it. Third parties, developers, people claiming, ideas, and things of that nature. Can you talk a bit about, and I know that there are some confidentiality issues, so you can't tell us in some cases, who the particular parties are and what the particular cases are, but can you tell us generally the types of things that you're seeing, the types of issues that you're being asked to testify as an expert with respect to in this space, in the video gaming space? Because I think that's a really interesting area that's really, I think, in the last several years coming up on the litigation front, and that we're seeing, Darius and I are seeing more and more of disputes involving all kinds of issues in the esports and video gaming realm.
2012, I would say, was a point where David and I started doing more expert witness work than we did game work. We still do game work. I'd say 30% of my time is games, and Dave the same. But 2012 was kind of the tipping point. I actually have done expert witness work since 1982. And the first case I actually did involved the seminal Ralph Baer patents for the original video game black box, which he created for Magnavox. And those Magnavox patents, Magnavox never made any money off the hardware. They put out the Magnavox Odyssey, and it didn't sell that well, mainly because people thought mistakenly that it only worked with Magnavox TV, but it worked with any TV. But he had these two patents that were 17 or 19 years of torturing the game industry. Every video game company lost on those patents. Twice I opposed them. Once for Activision, I tried to defend against them. Once for maybe it was Taito, Japanese company. I tried to oppose them, lost both times. Very proud that I lost. You couldn't beat them because they were the video game patents. So on and off between 80 and now, the word got around that I had done this, and nobody else had, I guess, at that point. So Nintendo called me when they were sued by Atari for antitrust violations when the NES came out. They had an agreement that said you could only publish games on the NES, not on other platforms. Like you could publish other games on other platforms, but a game could only go on their platform. And I did a case for them. And this went on through our years of work in the game industry, where once every few years I would do a case as long as there wasn't a conflict. 2012, we started doing more because we were less involved in the game industry, and there was more of this, and we just couldn't keep up with the demand. In fact, I brought Dave in 2012 and taught him how to do it because it was just me, and I couldn't come near the demand that was required. The cases we see generally fall into 2 or 3 categories. A lot of patent cases. If you know patents, you know that there was a few years ago, Alice ruling came down on patents. That stopped them, brought the volume way down because Alice knocked out a lot of software patents. But now we do a lot of IPRs, which were the result of Alice. Now you can go in and talk to the patent board and say this should have never been patented in the first place because of issues like Alice. So we do IPRs a lot. We do patent work a fair amount, but not as much as before. I do a lot of cases involving contracts because the video game industry is rampant with game projects that never get finished. I mean, just God, what? Half of them? 2/3 of them? You know, people spend tens of millions of dollars and at the end of the day don't have a game. Now, sometimes it's the publisher's fault. Sometimes it's the developer's fault. Sometimes the market changes. But inevitably, somebody is suing somebody saying, you know, what did I get for my $5 million? Or $10 million. And sometimes I'm on the side of the publisher. Sometimes I'm on the side of the developer. Because I've been on both sides. I mean, career-wise, I've probably negotiated 200 or 300 development contracts, some as a publisher, some as a developer. And then there are the copyright cases. You know, I do a lot of those. I have one active right now on a mobile game where somebody swooped in, and it was a very popular mobile game. Somebody swooped in and made a copy of it. Wow. He couldn't come up with your own game. And a copy of it down to details that are just nauseatingly similar. So do a lot of those. You know, the patent cases are fascinating. They're very hard. You guys know, you're attorneys. None of us can even like reading a patent. They're so hard to read. But, you know, Dave and I have gotten very good at reading them and very good at analyzing them. And I like the research aspect. You know, can I find a piece of prior art which does this before the claimed patent? And that's what really got us into it. People would call us up and go, you guys have been in the game industry since the 1970s. Have you ever heard of a game that's multiplayer, that does this, that, or the other thing before 2009? And we go, oh yeah, we can talk to you about that. So that started it, and then it expanded out beyond that. And, you know, we end up writing these massive reports. But you know, I really enjoy the work. Dave, less so. Dave doesn't like the testifying. He likes the analysis. So I'll tend to testify more, and he'll analyze a lot. And we do a lot of work for people like Sony, Nintendo, Microsoft. Those are like our 3 biggest clients. No surprise, right? And then there's a myriad of other clients. And most of it is video games. We've done other work, general mobile stuff, because I've developed, like, myself, written like a dozen iPhone games. So I know that architecture very well. We've published, between Dave and I, probably 30 mobile games. So we know that space. And sometimes we do things in interactive marketing. website development, general internet technologies, toys. We've done a couple of projects for Hasbro, but it spans the gamut. I find 90% of them intellectually stimulating, very interesting, and 10% of them are an absolute horror.
I'm going off script because I just find you absolutely fascinating, Garry. I'm curious. This universe that we are in, this gaming universe, is just it's ever changing. I mean, honestly, like sometimes on a daily basis. Right now, what's something that you, having been in this for so long, just think, oh my God, this is the coolest thing I've seen in a while? I mean, is there anything out there right now where you're just like, holy, this is just like really just like beyond cool?
The world is going to change when Apple Vision comes out. Okay. Apple's AR hardware. People see what they announced a couple of months ago, and you have all the haters on all social media. Oh, Quest, Oculus Quest has done the same thing, and so Microsoft HoloLens has done the same thing. Oh, it's all the same. They have no idea what they're talking about. That hardware in that device is so revolutionary. I don't know if you know anything about it hardware-wise, but
yes,
the best iPhone that you have, the best Samsung Galaxy, the resolution on those is astounding. It's so good, right? Yes. You have a $1,000 iPhone, resolution's unbelievable. Oculus takes that level of resolution, puts them over each eye, and puts you in a 3D world. Great. Is it going to change the world? No. You know what Apple does? They say, if you want to change the world, and they're AR. You're looking through lenses and you see the world around you. I'm not a huge believer in VR, which you don't see the world around you. You are blocked because people don't want to trip over the coffee table. I'm sorry. So
it hurts. I've done it. It hurts. It leaves a bruise. Not fun.
Yep. Yeah. And people have trouble with motion and things when their eyes are covered, and it's heavy. You wear it for 20 minutes, you want to rip it off. But AR, when you take AR and you increase the resolution, at some point, the objects in the AR space are going to look as good as real life. But that would take a lot of resolution. A lot of resolution. The resolution on Apple Vision is 64 pixels to 1 pixel on the best iPhone. 64 times the resolution on the best iPhone. That is mind-boggling. They spent an enormous amount of money creating an OLED display. I assume it's OLED of that resolution. And I don't know how they did it, but people say that when you put that on, it is mind-boggling. And you navigate by looking at icons. You don't do anything with your hands. You look at an icon and it lights up. Between those two things, anybody who says that's not going to be revolutionary is out of their cotton picking mind. It is going to change the world.
There you have it. There you have it. I think that's a perfect thing to end on for us, Garry. I mean, the next big thing that's going to change the world. For anyone that's been watching, if you have any questions about any of the topics we talked about today, drop them into the comments and we'll try to answer them without providing any real legal advice, of course. Keep in mind that this series is intended to be a very general discussion of legal issues in the video game space. It is not intended as actual legal advice. If you need actual legal advice, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to help you. I want to thank our very special guest. He's the guy that created this and so many other great games over so many years. Garry Kitchen, thank you for coming on with us.
Thanks for having me. It was great fun.
Thanks,
I hope
Garry.
we covered all the topics, or at least some of them.
We absolutely did. So for myself and my colleague Angie, until next time, we'll see you on Lawyers with Game.